Hey there interwebs, I hope you're all doing well. So for today's video, I want to have a brief discussion around a criticism that I've seen leveled at me as a leftist content creator, as well as some of my fellow leftist video essayists here on YouTube that have been targeted at us from other leftists. And I want to address it because I think it goes towards a discussion that we kind of all really need to have, as I think it's kind of an existential threat that we're going to be facing in the next few years. And it's a myopic version of that conversation, but I think it's indicative of a much larger conversation. And I think the best way to get into it is to discuss how I've seen this criticism come up against me recently, because I've seen a discourse in like places like Blue Sky come up around a video that I did at the end of 2023 talking about the Star Wars franchise. If you haven't seen it, it's actually one of my favorite videos I did. The quick version of that 6-hour video is me talking about the Star Wars franchise and auteur theory and how people have venerated George Lucas and how that mirrors his shift as a creator into him kind of becoming more part of the Hollywood and capitalist machine, creating Lucasfilm and things like that, and then selling Star Wars to Disney and Disney sort of corporatizing the franchise and the message of the franchise, and how that mirrors Star Wars itself as a franchise and work of art, how it started off as this like very anti-fascist work of art, and then how it became more merchandised over time, lost a little bit of its message over time, how the prequels had this very like how neoliberalism falls to fascist message, but ultimately like had a lot more aesthetic than substance in a lot of its critique, and then how Disney has removed a lot of the substance just for aesthetic of Star Wars and trying to merchandise it. And so talking about how this veneration of singular creators mirrors the hero's journey, mirrors also authoritarianism, as well as how capitalism strips meaning and context from work, sort of that Mark Fisher-esque, capitalism recapitulates any critique of itself for itself, and how ultimately all of that stuff is sort of a gateway into fascism, and sort of like the story of Star Wars also reflecting the story of Star Wars the product, as well as reflecting the creators and owners of Star Wars over time. It's kind of a complicated one. It's much more than I think some people have like simplified it as, where I'm saying auteur theory is fascist, which is not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's a mirror of all of these things, but regardless of the point, the ultimate critique that I see people have about that video, as well as like similar videos in the fact that I talk about something like Star Trek or Star Wars a lot, these big corporate franchises owned by mega corporations, is that people ultimately say like, hey, you as a leftist are often talking about these very corporatized media. And I'll praise something like Star Wars Andor, which I actually think is one of the very few projects from Disney Star Wars era that is explicitly anti-fascist and has a really political agenda, I think, behind its stories, and point out the fact like these are things made by corporations. They are ultimately not going to be the revolution that we need. They're not going to like spark the change that we really need. These aren't the works of art that these aren't the droids that you're looking for. The works of art that you're looking for really in-depth leftist conversations. And I very much agree with that idea on its face. I mean, we could look at something very overt like Squid Game, which is also a very anti-capitalist work of art, and see how like Beast Games and the Squid Game reality show that Netflix made had sort of like taken this very anti-capitalist work of art and just stripped it of all of its meaning just to sell it back as like an empty aesthetic, as like Halloween costumes, like the Squid Game Halloween costume, like removing any critique of it and just selling it back to you. And it goes again to that same idea of like capitalism can reclaim and resell to you and strip all meaning from works of art.
Capital has the ability to subsume all critiques into itself. Even those who would critique capital end up reinforcing it instead.
That was something I was talking about very clearly in my Star Wars video as well. And so I've seen this critique about how people get bothered or critique me about talking about something like Star Wars Andor and saying like, yeah, Star Wars Andor maybe have anti-fascist messages, but it's gonna ultimately be corporatized. Like, hell, I even have a Star Wars Andor figure on my shelf back there. Like, I bought the merch, I bought the things. You're still supporting this system. And again, I agree with all of these things. But I also think you're missing a trick if you just dismiss that outright, because a lot of this critique, not all of it, I don't want to straw man it too much, but like a lot of these folks ultimately will like point out like, well, you should be reading more Mark Fisher, or you should be reading more James C. Scott, or the Communist Manifesto, and putting it out there for people. And I do think like people should be reading those things. But ultimately, at the end of the day, like if I'm sitting here making videos about James C. Scott or, talking about the Communist Manifesto every time, like that's not a good gateway to get people into these things. The mainstream culture is focused on things like Star Wars or Star Trek. I think that we need to use these mainstream's touchstones to start to be gateways into leftist theory. Like, one of the big criticisms that I hear about me is like, oh, I'm just some shallow leftist masquerading as like someone more revolutionary. Like I'm an anarchist. I'm not necessarily someone who's like, I want the revolution right now. I believe in more sort of change from within, build up within your communities, sort of like build society, the society you want in your community around you sort of argument. But the argument that I often see is people belittling me and insulting my intelligence or my awareness of a lot of these issues. And like, look, you can talk about my intelligence all day. You're allowed to. I'm a figure on the internet. Whatever, do whatever you want. But it does frustrate me a little bit because it's like I'm not ignorant of these things. Like I don't even know if you can tell. Like I don't want to be like, oh, look at the shelf of books in some performative way. But like, if you can see down here, like I have books like called Avant-Garde Fascism, Seeing Like a State. I have, for those of you who want to see it, like I literally have this like books on liberalism and shit like that. Like there's books on anarchism. Down here, like A Just Society. And I'm not ignorant of these things. Now you can critique whether or not you think I express them well enough or understand them, whatever. Like that's fine. That's up to you to critique. But I'm not ignorant of them. But the reason that I focus on things like Star Wars and Star Trek is one, I need my joy too. I like these things. I'm a nerd. It's what I like to talk about. But also, if we're talking about like a strategy in terms of when we talk about progressive issues, I like using these things as a gateway into getting people to think about these topics. Like Star Wars Andor, as a TV series, is never going to be the revolution. It's never going to spark the revolution. It is a product made by Disney and is going to be commodified by Disney. But there are ways to discuss in that show how anti-fascist movements come about, what collective action looks like. That show is very clearly pulling from things like Sergei Eisenstein's sort of, film theory and going back to things like Metropolis or talking about collective action, pulling from history of, guerrilla groups and anti-fascist actions. The filmmaking on display in the show is also very clearly pointing out how collective actions do cost people. Like people die during collective actions, and the show focuses on that in a very, I think, deeply emotional way that takes full advantage of the filmmaking medium. Like there's things to discuss within that show around that, and I think it would be a loss to not discuss those things in ways that people who just come onto YouTube to hear someone talk about Star Wars might see. Someone might click on my video, want a video essay about Star Wars, and I give that to them, and they maybe learn a little bit more about these things that isn't me just sitting here ranting James C. Scott at you or Mark Fisher at you, but doing it in a way that talks about a mainstream thing that people care about. And I think if we look at how the far right have done the exact same thing over the past decade or so, the better part of a decade, you can see kind of how effective it is. The outrage merchants, we rail against the outrage merchants, the people like your nerdrotics or your critical drinkers or whatever. We break them down all the time and point out how their critiques of TV shows are very surface level. They're always ranting about woke DEI or forced diversity or the ruining of the hating of men in media or whatever nonsense that they want to talk about, or in video games, how every single time a video game comes out with any woman that has any sort of non-sexualized feature sort of sets everybody off.
Woke DEI agenda is trying to ruin our ability to masturbate at every single woman in a video game.
And how they're clearly sort of pushing this white supremacist, patriarchal worldview that views everyone around them as objects for them to use, and sort of reinforcing that status quo message. We critique that all the time, we talk about it all the time, but we also have to acknowledge, it's effective in the sense that they continually put out these videos that do a ton because the algorithm rewards it because A, it's outrage bait, and B, it's focused on mainstream stuff like Star Wars and Star Trek. And it gets attention, and it radicalizes people into these views. The radicalization YouTube pipeline isn't what it was years ago, but these are gateway points into people thinking about things in conservative ways. And I think we need to be doing the same. And ultimately, we're seeing the fruits of their labor right now. Certainly, it's not the only reason, but there is a reason we are seeing a cultural shift to the conservative way of thinking in the mainstream. Not just by evidence of Donald Trump getting elected, but a conservative ethos has just really just pervaded a lot of our culture. And yes, it's evidence of how neoliberalism constantly caters to fascism. Yes, that is evidence of it. But it also speaks to how well a lot of these folks are propagandizing conservative thought, and doing it through video games, and doing it through mainstream TV shows, or doing it through, political discourses and podcasts and what have you. It's a pervasive thing that just continually reinforces these narratives over and over and over again, which is partially how people start to take it as normal. Human beings, if we hear things just enough times, we start to believe it. It's the same thing like as a queer person, like you hear as a queer or trans person, especially a young queer or trans person, over and over and over again that queer people are awful, trans people are awful, queer people are awful. It starts to invade your brain, and it gets you self-hating, and it's what leads to things like the suicide rate for queer and trans people. Even though we are queer and trans, I've been feeling it a lot lately as a trans person. Like, my mental health is shit. Not because I believe being trans is awful, but because I continually see it over and over and over again in the culture, and like, it gets in you, and it just sucks. And it's like, we need to be doing that on a much larger level as leftists. And it's hard. That's hard to do. We live within a capitalist system that, again, tries to like strip all critique, to shove down criticisms of itself and strip it of meaning. So like, I'm not saying we're not up against a larger fight than conservatives. There's a reason conservative outrage gets promoted more. But it is something that we should be thinking about and how to do more. And I'm not sitting here thinking like my video on Star Wars Andor is going to get someone to like pick up, start joining a militia, or hell, even just doing what I want them to do is like anarchistic, like getting involved in your community stuff. It's a video about Star Wars. But it is an entry point for people to be thinking about these things. That's how I got into all of this stuff. Like, I was a Trek fan as a kid. I was a Trekkie nerd. And Trek helped me come out as trans. It was a thing that, like, helped me see who I was. And then being trans sort of put me in queer groups. And queer groups sort of started pushing me into thinking more about gender. Gender got me into Judith Butler. Judith Butler got me into more, like, other stuff. And so on and so forth. And it's a gateway point into these larger conversations. And I get frustrated over and over and over again, seeing people getting angry on the internet, being like, you need to be more woke, you need to understand leftist theory, you need to da-da-da-da-da, how dare you recommend people go and watch Star Wars Andor. And like, yes, I do think there's an effort that I need to do to start to get people to read, more eclectic work. Like, I want to get people to read more trans work. Like, one of my favorite artists right now is Alison Rumsfeld, who like writes about fascism and is like a trans author doing some really cool stuff. As well, and like reading more Ursula K. Le Guin or things like that. As a sci-fi nerd, I'm just pointing those as options, but like there's other ones as well. Like, I do think those are things of art that people need to be pushed more towards reading, but there's also value in talking about these mainstream things, because we need to start thinking about how we, for lack of a better word, and it's a good word I actually think, propagandize these things to a larger audience, because I think we have been very insular these past few years, and not thinking about how to actually build this up as a mainstream consciousness. There's a reason why the idea of consciousness raising is a big part of leftist theory, because you may not get everyone to read James C. Scott or read Mark Fisher or read whoever XYZ person you want people to read. Read the ABCs of anarchism or whatever. Like, you're not gonna get people to like read those, but you may get them to start thinking about these ideas that are present in those things. And that's what the ultimate goal, right? The ultimate goal isn't to get people to start spouting off theory. It's to get people to start thinking about the world in ways that build up solidarity, build up working class consciousness, building up consciousness in your communities, not just online communities, not thinking about conservative thought of like, we need to protect the status quo, we need to protect these institutions built on white supremacy, but get people to start thinking about how we rethink the future and rethink the way that we live. It's why I like talking about stuff like Star Trek. Star Trek is not the most radically leftist show. It's a generally progressive show, but it's still not radically leftist. It still upholds a sort of status quo-y mindset. But it is a show that showcases like a future that is beyond the present day, that is hopeful. And you can use that to talk about like, hey, how do we think about maybe reinventing our systems, our institutions? Like, it's an entry point to that. And I think that that's an important tactic. And I also get frustrated by people always being like, oh, you're not doing the thing that I'm doing, therefore you're bad. I see this constant come up in many different shades and variations where it's like, oh, you're doing something different as a leftist than I do, you're wrong. You're getting things wrong. You're bad, you're wrong, this is a terrible tactic. It's like, we should have a multitude of tactics. Because if we all do one single thing, if we all work the same exact way or do the same thing or talk to the same people, that's an easy way for us to fail very easily. We need to try different things to see how well they work and how effective they work. They may be effective in different areas. It's also a good way for fascists to be able to undermine us. If we're all doing the same thing, fascists need to be like, oh, we fucked that up, and then they're done. They don't have anything else. Like, we should be trying to diversify everything that we do. And for me, like, look, I am never going to be like, here on YouTube as a creator, I'm never going to spark the revolution. I don't really believe that art necessarily is like ever, like, it can be in some cases, but I say this as an artist, I don't believe that art is the thing that like sparks the change. But I do believe that art can be a way to get people to start thinking about these things, can be an entry point into things, can spark something within somebody to maybe get them to start seeing the world in a different way, to change their worldview. And yes, then that comes like directing people towards political action, directing people to things in their community, directing people to something more tangible beyond the art. But it can be a start of that journey. And I think that that's what's valuable about art. It's a way to show people a way of thinking about the world that is different than they live in their own life, or put into practice things in fiction that they may not have seen in their real life, so they can maybe think about like how it might be facilitated in their day-to-day. I think that's where art has value, and that's where I think something like what I do on YouTube has value. Like, I'm a commodity here on YouTube. I'm a creator here on YouTube that is always like a thing that YouTube is selling. And so I'm never going to be able to, as much as I want to, like just by the basis of what this, medium is and what I'm doing, I can never be beyond that. My cats are fighting in the other room. Stop being good leftists and stop fighting with each other, damn it. But ultimately, that's just kind of what I wanted to talk about, because it's just frustrating to me I just get these very myopic criticisms of like, oh, well, you recommended Star Wars Andor at the end of a video? Like, not a very good leftist, you're asking them to consume Disney products. Like, yeah, I guess. I don't disagree with your point, like, how it's a Disney product, but like, there is value in some way of talking about these topics through these mainstream products. And again, you have to be aware of the limits of that. I'm not sitting here being like, I am the arbiter of the revolution or whatnot. And again, I want to be clear, like, I am not someone who agitates for violent revolution right now. Like, we will have to face like larger systemic forces at some point, and violence is going to be a part of that in some way, shape, or form, but it's not something we should be actively seeking or glorifying as like a glorious revolution. I believe that we build things in our community, we build solidarity in our community, be it like, working class solidarity or community solidarity around us, things like that. Like, that's more what I push for. And like, ultimately, if you start building up these, different systems that provide resources to people that the state once provided, you will ultimately come into conflict with the state at some point, but it's not something that you should be actively seeking, because it's not going to end well, I don't think, for anybody. But ultimately, like, different people have different views on that, and that's fine. I think we can have discussion on that. But I do get very frustrated with the very like limited thinking of like the value of what something like this can be to propagandize the mainstream leftist ideals. Anyway, it's just something I wanted to kind of talk about, because it just frustrates me every single time. Like, throw a book at them and think that that'll help get the theory in. It's like, theory is important. You should read it. Like, I've read a bunch of it, and you should be reading it. But like, it's not what's ultimately going to lead to praxis, Anyways, I hope you all, my friends, live long and prosper. Take care, and see you on the next one. I never end that. Why did I end that way? That's a way I never end before.